Well, hi there. I'm Nan, and I welcome you back to our Kids Corner videos from the book Holy Troublemakers and Unconventional Saints. Today we're going to hear about Danny Cortez. And here's a picture of Danny. All the pictures in the book are artists' drawings of the person. It's part of the charm of the book. Let's just say that. So, let's find out about Danny. It's a Sunday morning in January 2014, and Danny Cortez is very nervous. He's so nervous that he feels lightheaded, and his blood pressure is so high that a doctor would have told him to go straight to the hospital. But instead, Danny is about to go to the church, where he's been pastor for almost 2 decades, to preach a sermon. This sermon is the reason why he's so anxious. It's going to be the most controversial thing he's ever preached, and he knows people in his church will be upset. In fact, he expects he's going to lose his job over this sermon. So what's so challenging about Danny's planned sermon? He's planning to say it's okay to be gay. Danny is a pastor of a very conservative church that does not think it's okay for LGBTQ persons to be themselves. Danny knows that for a lot of people, it's hard to understand why accepting gay people is such a big deal. Love is love, we say. Love makes a family. But he knows a lot of people in his congregation grew up being told that God forbids people of the same gender to marry and have a family together. Up until recently, Danny agreed with his church's official teachings. Over the years as a pastor, he had even told numerous gay and lesbian people who had privately confided in him that they had to try to change their sexual orientation so they could fall in love with someone of the opposite sex or live life without any family at all. But he had changed his mind. Now he needed to tell his church why he had changed his mind, and he knew this was likely the only time he would get this chance. If he didn't give this sermon, he'd miss the chance to explain his change of heart in his own words. God, please don't let me have a heart attack, he prayed, and then he drove to church. Now, Danny was born in the Philippines to a Catholic family. When he was a young child, his family moved to the U.S., and Danny eventually became a Southern Baptist minister. Soon he had a good job, a family, 3 sons and a daughter. He loved his job and his church, and life was good. When people asked him questions about challenges in their lives, he felt confident giving them Bible verses that clearly gave them answers about the will of God in their lives. Every now and then, a person who was LGBTQ was honest with Danny about their identity, and usually he just recited the verses and advice he'd always been told applied to people who were not heterosexual. Danny started to feel uneasy about telling people that their only option was to live life alone, without any hope of a special someone to share their life's journey with, or to try very hard to fall in love with someone from a gender they felt no romantic feelings toward. He remembered Jesus teaching about how someone could tell a bad tree by the bad fruit that grew on it, and they could tell a good tree by the good fruit that grew on it. The good fruit or bad fruit test had been important to Danny when evaluating an idea. Does this idea, such as that everyone should be heterosexual, seem to bring more goodness and love into the world? Or does it seem to bring more bitterness, isolation, and fear into the world? Danny started to suspect that his advice to LGBTQ was bad fruit. A young lesbian woman who had been a member of his church challenged him to actually dive into studying the topic of the Bible and LGBTQ people. There were lots of new books on the subject, and many Christians were starting to believe that what the church had assumed for several hundreds of years might be wrong, the same way that the church had assumed for several hundreds of years that God supported slavery. And actually, there's another story about the several hundreds of years, but we'll read about that another time. The Southern Baptist Church that Danny was a part of had been especially wrong about slavery and had split from the larger Baptist denomination just prior to the Civil War in the U.S. due to its support of slavery. So Danny knew that even church leaders could be wrong, and they had been in the past. Danny got a stack of books, pulled out his Bible, said a prayer, and started reading. He also started listening to LGBTQ people who had left his church, as well as other churches, because of how they'd been treated. Danny had always loved the story in the Gospels about a shepherd who risked everything to go after one sheep out of 100 who was lost. It's a story about God caring so much about the one person who might not be safe that he'd go after just that one person, says Danny. Danny started to see that Jesus cared the most about those who were marginalized and rejected. Jesus wasn't afraid to take a religious rule and offer a new teaching. He especially cared about the people who were the most rejected by the religious leaders of his time. Gradually, Danny started to change his mind, recognizing that in the churches he'd always been a part of, LGBTQ people were the most marginalized. One day he sat on a blanket at a beach a little ways from his house. He realized he no longer believed it was a sin to be LGBTQ and to want to find love and companionship. Danny jumped up in the air several times on the beach. That's how relieved and happy he felt. I'm so joyful, he remembers now. I felt strongly that God had led me to change my mind. A few weeks later, Danny was driving his 15-year-old son, Drew, to school. A song by hip-hop duo Macklemore and Ryan Lewis called Same Love came on the radio, and Danny started singing the lyrics that clearly supported same-sex love and marriage. Drew looked at his dad quizzically and asked, "Dad, do you know what that song is about? Supporting gay marriage?" "Yes, I do," Danny said, "and I think I've changed my mind about all that. What do you think?" Drew looked at his father in amazement. He took a deep breath and then he said, "Oh, Dad, I'm gay." Danny pulled the car over to hug his son. How grateful he felt that God had already led him to have a change of heart and mind, now that he could just love and accept his son without any conditions. But Drew still didn't want to be gay. He later told his family, "If someone had a pill to give me that would make me stop being gay, I would take it." Danny knew his son was struggling with who he was. So he responded, "If I had a pill I could give you that would change you, I wouldn't, because you are perfect just the way God made you." And for the first time, Danny realized that this is what good fruit looks like when engaged with a gay person. Drew later said that he was so grateful for his dad's reaction. He knows not all LGBTQ children get the same kind of response from their parents. Love is a choice, Drew said. My dad chose to be loving. But back to the big sermon Danny needed to give at his church to explain his new convictions. Danny kept reliving that scene in the car over and over in his mind as he prepared to preach. He was doing this for Drew and for all the other kids who needed to know a pastor would risk his job to speak up for them. He told the congregation his story. He told them how he felt God leading him to change his mind. He reminded them that well-intentioned Christians had been wrong before, and he told them he felt so strongly about this that he was willing to lose his job to speak the truth. At the end of the hour, Danny ended his sermon by saying a prayer, and then he walked off the platform. He got a huge hug from his other son, felt his blood pressure return to normal, and felt at peace with whatever would happen next. The lovely and surprising thing about this story of courage is that Danny didn't lose his job like he thought he would. The congregation was stunned by his sermon, but they also had known Danny as a sincere man of God for so long, they were willing to listen. The congregation met and decided that maybe God really was speaking an updated truth through Danny that day. Maybe in the same way lots of churches had supported slavery for hundreds of years and then had to change their theology when they realized that had never been God's idea. The situation was similar. They voted to dedicate 6 months to study, discuss, and to pray about the issue. After that 6-month period, the congregation voted to become a fully inclusive church, where all are included and belong, with a special emphasis on fully including LGBTQ people. That decision shocked Danny. He'd been so sure he'd lose his job. I was so surprised, Danny remembers. When people show up in love and remember who Jesus was and what Jesus cared about, miracles happen. Wow. He had a lot of courage, and so did his son. I think he got it from his dad. So, there's our story for today. You guys have a great evening, and I'll see you again on Wednesday. Bye, and God bless.